Hello, year eights. Today we're going to be looking at a little bit of the history of the medieval period or the Middle Ages. Now, when we first introduced the Middle Ages, we talked about how it expanded across a huge span of history. Depending on what measure you're using, it's probably around about 1,000 years from start to finish between the end of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy and in other parts of Europe. So it's a huge period of time, and it's one where we have to get our dates right. Okay, so there's a little bit of dating that happens in history. You need to know what happened and in what order it happened to make sense of everything that's going on. Now, history's not just about memorizing dates and places, and in fact, anyone who sort of shows off their historical knowledge just by rote learning dates is not really, I would say, that interested in history at all. But it's a really important starting place so that we can start to put together the pieces and work out why things that happen at the end of the period that we're looking at are dependent on things that happen at the beginning of the period. So we're going to put a few things in order today. I'm just going to go up to the end of the 11th century. I want you to follow along, pause the video where necessary, and take whatever notes you deem appropriate in your exercise books. So this is a bit that we've already looked at, but I'm just going to reiterate it because it's important. It was a big moment in the history of Western civilization when the Roman Empire, as it was, came to an end. Now, if you ever go on to study history at a higher level, perhaps you might go to university and study it there, you'll find that there's more to it than simply one era ending and another era beginning. But for our purposes today, we're going to say that the Roman Empire in the West, in Western Europe, and remember that it carried on in the East, in Greece and Anatolia and other places for a long time afterwards. But in Western Europe, it came to an end in 476 AD when Rome fell to a barbarian invasion. And there were lots of tribes who were migrating into the Roman Empire because as Rome began to get weaker, its frontiers became more porous, meaning that it was easier to cross over from the non-Roman part of Europe into the Roman part of Europe and settle there. And people were driven by population movements in other parts of Europe and Asia, changes in the climate and things like that. So there was a lot of mass migration going on. And a lot of these tribes settled in what is now Italy, France, Spain, and parts of North Africa that had all been part of the Roman Empire. So you can see that here. And it's really important, I think, to get to grips with the geography of Europe. So when we come back to learning in person this week, what I'm going to have you guys do is a few test runs where we're going to look at names and places and see whether we can put those two things together to get a better sense of European and world geography for this unit. But you can see there that for all intents and purposes, the Western Roman Empire is just Italy and the sort of surrounding areas in the center there in that darkish blue. And you've got various kingdoms that are dominated by barbarian tribes. And remember that we start to see some of those feudal contracts start to develop there. So the barbarian kings come in. Most of the land and most of the people is still dominated by people who identify as Romans. But they get a new ruling class in the form of the barbarian kings and their followers who enter into a feudal contract with the people who live there. And they say, look, we'll continue to govern you fairly well if you continue to pay some sort of taxes to us, if you continue to give us use of your manpower when we need you in war and things like that. And so they settle into a bit of a pattern in the kingdom of the Visigoths there in Spain, or in Burgundy, or in the kingdom of Francia that develops in what is now France. And things are relatively sort of stable, not as good as they were at the height of the Roman Empire, but they've swapped one type of governance for another, and that's okay. And by the 8th century, end of the 8th century AD, going into the 9th century, it kind of looked like Western Europe was recovering from the fall of Rome. So it wasn't going to be quite the catastrophic event that some might make it out to be. In France, the Frankish king Charlemagne was crowned emperor in 800 AD. And it was the first time we'd kind of heard of this concept of empire since the Roman Empire fell. So he went all the way to Rome, which was quite a journey from what would have been his seat in Paris at the time, just so the Pope could put a crown on his head and say, this man is the new Roman emperor, even though he spoke something that would have been kind of incomprehensible to Romans of 300 years earlier. All right, so we've got a little bit of continuity. There's still a kind of a sense that Rome is a real thing, and that you can revive the Roman Empire and have it be great again. And this is I apologize for the pixelated quality of this image. This is what the Frankish Empire, that big chunk in blue in the middle, looks like. So Charlemagne ruled over a big part of Europe, Western Europe, France, Italy, the western part of what is now Germany, and spreading into parts of Eastern Europe there very briefly, and also areas of the Netherlands and Belgium as they are now. Okay, so it's a fairly extensive empire and very difficult to govern in the Middle Ages because, as we've seen, communication's not very good, roads aren't very good, there's not a lot of money around, so that makes it hard to transfer wealth to people in the outer parts of the empire. And it's not a situation that can last very long, and we're going to see why. The reason is there are threats from the outside. And around about the same time as Charlemagne comes to power, there are 3 threats that Europe, or Western Europe, or Christian Europe, or however you want to define it, faces from the outside world. And those 3 are the Vikings in the north, the Arabs in the south, and the Magyars in the east. And if you think those threats are going to, rise up and get beaten off, well, you're very much mistaken, because the Vikings are now Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and other people. The Arabs are still in North Africa there, and for a long time lived quite peaceably in Spain. And the Magyars are modern-day Hungarians. So we're going to see how Europe doesn't necessarily defeat them militarily, but sort of incorporates them into a sense of a bigger Europe. So here's where they come from. You can see the Vikings in red. The Vikings were pushed out of their homeland because they had a huge population explosion and they didn't have enough land to support all those people. So they hopped aboard their longboats and began navigating the rivers of Eastern Europe and the seas of northwestern Europe and also the Mediterranean. The Vikings got as far as Rome and Constantinople, and we think probably they also occasionally made the crossing of the Atlantic, because there's evidence of Viking settlements in what is now Canada, which is a pretty significant achievement. You can see the Muslims there. The Muslims, as you know, Islam started in what is now Saudi Arabia, down in the very bottom right-hand corner of the map, and spread out across North Africa and made the little hop, as you can see in those yellow lines, across the Straits of Gibraltar and into what is now Spain. And they made it more or less up to the French border, where the Pyrenees are, the mountains there between France and Spain. And lastly, you can see the Magyars. The Magyars were horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia, so they came from sort of the center right-hand side of the map there. And they were one of many waves of immigrant tribes coming from Central Asia into Europe. And they settled around about where you can see that big blue blob there a little bit to the north of it in what is now Hungary. And modern day Hungarians speak a language that is very different from other European languages because they have a very different set of roots from the rest of, or most of the rest of Europe. And here's a bit of a clearer map for you. So you can see, again, all the bits in purple are occupied by Norsemen who are raiding and rowing and just sort of getting around and seeing what the world's about. The orange bit in the bottom left-hand corner there, and you can see at the height they had all the Mediterranean islands, so Corsica, Sardinia and Sicily, and most of Spain and Portugal. And they had quite in many ways, quite an advanced civilization and an advanced form of governance. A common fact that you'll hear is that the city of Cordoba, there in southern Spain, which was ruled by Muslim rulers, had things like public sanitation and public lighting well before anyone in Western Europe had those things. So they were quite a successful civilization. And you can see in green the Magyar horsemen spreading out and getting around, raiding bits of Europe before finally settling down. Okay, almost at the end. After the Age of Invasion, Western Europe ceased to develop, and we kind of slip into what is popularly known as the Dark Ages. Now, there's a bit of debate about how dark the Dark Ages were, but it's certainly true that compared to the period before the Dark Ages and the period after the Dark Ages, and we're talking around about 700 to 1000 AD, give or take, before and after that period, Europe produced a lot more in the way of technology and culture and writing and that kind of thing than it did during that period. But by the time 1000 AD rolls around, so the 11th century, Western Europe's starting to look elsewhere. It's starting to look outward again. And they start to have holy wars because they are beginning to think of themselves again as a united bloc. And Western Europeans, kings and popes and so forth, start referring to themselves as part of Christendom, which just means a united Christian world. In this period, we start to see that the popes are building up their power, they're building up their influence with Christian rulers, and they start to make requests of Christian rulers for various reasons and in various ways. And they lead, or they call for, crusades throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, in what is now Spain, Germany, and the Middle East. And we're going to have a little look at a map of that here. So you can see Western Christianity, so Catholic Europe is in purple, and again, I apologize for the image. You can see Orthodox Europe is Russian and Greek Orthodox predominantly, but also Bulgarian Orthodox in orange. And you can see the Muslim world there in green. The wars that they fought against Muslims in the Middle East were called Crusades. And they also, just to go back to that previous map, if you can see that yellowish bit up in the north there, that's where pagan tribes lived. So they were people who hadn't been converted to Christianity or Islam. And in the Middle Ages, the Catholic world called a number of crusades against them too. So that's in what's now Germany, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on. The Pope in 1096, so this is at the end of the 11th century, called a crusade to retake Jerusalem from the Muslim rulers who had ruled there for a number of centuries. And a whole bunch of kings and other rulers from around the Catholic world sent troops and went themselves. They were told by the Pope that if they went on a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land, all their sins would be forgiven. And for a very religious society, that's a big deal. So here's the Pope telling everyone what's what. And here are our crusaders setting out. They were all marked with a cross so that everyone knew why they were there. They were on a holy mission. We'll leave it there. We're going to pick up in the Kingdom of Jerusalem tomorrow when we're back together at school.